triangles are actually waves in disguise. Alright?
In nature, we observe numerous phenomena that propagate in the form of waves, or can be described by the concept of a wave. To understand these phenomena, we model them mathematically. It is remarkable that the mathematical description of a wave, even when solving complicated differential equations, can be traced back to a simple geometric shape, the triangle. So how can a wave arise from a triangle? Let's find out. First of all, there are an infinite number of triangles with different sizes, orientations, and angles. But which one is the coolest? Well, for the Babylonians, it was the equilateral triangle. They were so impressed by it that they even formulated the concept of an angle based on it. In a sense, what they observed between two sides was one angle. And because all sides of this triangle are equal in length, it had 3 of them. And because these people used the sexagesimal system for the concept of numbers, which is a number system based on the number 60, they loved to divide different things into 60 parts. Not only were units of time divided into 60 parts, but also units of space. So they imagined that this angle also consisted of 60 equal parts. One angle therefore corresponds to 60 angle parts, which we now call degrees and symbolize with a circle. Since exactly 6 of these form a complete circle, we measure 6 times 60 or 360 degrees in a circle. When humans later discovered that they had 10 fingers and began using the decimal number system, they were not very amused by the fact that the Babylonians divided spacetime by 60. So they divided the units of time further into powers of 10, and the angle measurement also had to be changed. For this purpose, a fascinating property of a circle was used. If we divide the length of the circumference c by the length of the diameter d, that is, if we calculate the ratio of circumference to diameter, we get a number that always remains the same, no matter how large or small we make the circle. Today we know this number as pi. If we rearrange the equation and set the diameter equal to 2 times the radius, the circumference corresponds to 2 pi times the radius. With a radius of 1, the circumference is simply 2 times pi. And it was precisely this circle that was used as a template for a new measurement of angular units, which is why it became known as the unit circle. Instead of imagining that, for example, a 60-degree angle consists of 60 parts, we place our circle template with its center at the tip of the angle and measure the length of the arc that this angle encloses. In the case of this angle, the arc length corresponds to 1/6 of the entire circumference, that is 2 pi divided by 6, or pi thirds in reduced form. At a 90-degree angle, the arc occupies a quarter of the circle, so this angle corresponds to a quarter of 2 pi, or half of pi for short. Because we use this angle so often and want to recognize it quickly, we mark it with an additional dot. And for a full circle, we eventually measure the complete circumference of 2 pi. Oh, and the coolest triangle was no longer the equilateral triangle, but the right-angled triangle, because it can do everything that other triangles can do, and in addition, the Pythagorean theorem applies to it. Furthermore, we can construct any other triangle from 2 right-angled ones. So if we understand the right-angled triangle, we understand all the others. For the study of triangles, known as trigonometry, it is therefore sufficient to examine the right-angled triangle. Alright, let's first name the individual sides. The side opposite the right angle is called the hypotenuse, the other ones are called legs. From the perspective of an angle, which I will simply call alpha, we can also name the legs more precisely. The side opposite to alpha is then called the opposite leg, and the one adjacent to the angle is called the adjacent leg. From the perspective of the other angle, we would swap these accordingly. With these 3 sides, we can create a total of 6 ratios, whereby in the last 3 ratios only the numerator and the denominator of the first 3 are swapped. And now comes the remarkable part. As with the circle, these ratios also correspond to a number that does not change no matter how large or small we make the triangle. For the number to change, for example in the first ratio, we would have to change only the numerator or only the denominator. But how can we change the numerator, which is the length of the opposite side, without changing the denominator, which is the length of the hypotenuse? Well, we would have to change the angle alpha. Meaning, if we set the hypotenuse to a fixed length and increase or decrease the angle alpha, then the ratios change. So if these ratios only change when alpha changes, then we can also understand them as functions that depend on alpha. Each of these functions has been given its own name. The first one is called sine, the next one cosine, then there's tangent, cotangent, secant, and cosecant. If we choose a fixed length for the hypotenuse, then we might as well choose a length that simplifies everything a little bit. For instance, with a length of 1, the sine of alpha simply corresponds to the length of the opposite side, and the cosine to the length of the adjacent side. And even better, we see that we can calculate the other ratios using just the sine and cosine. In other words, if we understand these two, we also understand the others. And we can now also use our unit circle template to measure the angle alpha. Alright, now we need to visualize these functions. Let's start with the sine. To do this, let's draw a coordinate system and plot the angle on the x-axis and the length of the opposite side on the y-axis. If we increase the angle slightly, the opposite side becomes longer. As we approach an angle of 0, the length becomes smaller and smaller. At an angle of exactly 0, the opposite side disappears. But we can imagine that it's still there, just with a length of 0. If we now rotate around the entire circle and trace the path, we obtain this curve for the sine. Here, negative lengths mean that the opposite side is in the lower semicircle. And that looks like a wave, doesn't it? For the cosine, we can simply copy the coordinate system and offset it by 90 degrees, because the adjacent side is offset by 90 degrees to the opposite side. However, we can also draw the cosine function in the same coordinate system. Here we can also see that the cosine looks exactly like the sine. It's just shifted by 90 degrees, or half of pi. So if we understand the sine, we also understand the cosine. And finally, we can extend the sine function to a larger angle range. We can just agree that we can keep rotating around the circle beyond 2 pi. And a negative angle just means we rotate clockwise. And with that, we have managed to develop a mathematical description for a wave out of a triangle. In reality, of course, not all waves look like this pure sine wave. But we can manipulate this function with additional numbers. For example, if we multiply the sine by a certain number, we influence the height of a wave crest, the so-called amplitude. And if we multiply the angle by a certain number, we influence its frequency. We can also shift the function in the x or y direction, or even put alpha into a separate function.
Although often depicted as little balls orbiting the nucleus like planets in the solar system, electrons actually exist in these strange globules we call orbitals. But they seem very strange. Why wouldn't they just be like this orbital? How can they possibly look like this? That's what we're going to try to tackle today. To begin, the first thing I need you to know is that everything is waves. Electrons, protons, photons, you and me, we're all waves. But at large scales, These waves behave more like particles, so it makes sense why we don't really discuss the wave-like nature of reality. But at very small scales, like the volume around an atom, we can no longer ignore the wave-like nature of all things. And waves behaves, or there are limitations to how a wave can manifest in these very small environments. Let's start by looking at a basic one-dimensional wave. A wave is characterized by its wavelength and amplitude. But honestly, the amplitude doesn't really change the wave itself. If I play a 600 Hz sine wave and another with greater amplitude, I still call them 600 Hz. We really only care about the wavelength. A traveling wave can exist on a spectrum of infinite possible wavelengths. However, what if I clamp this edge of a wave? As I start the oscillation, everything looks normal, but when the wavefront reaches this end, well, the wave medium is clamped and can't move. The wavefront wants to excite this point, but instead suddenly this excitation is resisted, which causes a snap or force applied with the opposite amplitude. This force propagates backwards down the wave. This is often visualized as a reflecting wave. If we repeat and I keep the initial wave visible, we can see that as the initial wave reaches this point at its maximum amplitude, the wave should be here, but instead it's here. The only way for that to happen is if an equally strong negative force is exerted on the wave medium. This strong negative force propagates backwards. When it aligns with the negative amplitude of the initial wave, it constructs with the total amplitude. As you would expect, when it aligns with a strong positive amplitude, they destruct. If we keep this going, eventually we stop seeing moving wavefronts and instead a standing wave materializes. Standing waves occur anytime you constrict the boundaries for waves. We still have infinite potential standing waves as we can freely adjust the wavelengths, but what if I also clamp the other edge? Now our wave is going to behave. Because we have clamped both edges, there are a finite number of waves that can exist here. Mathematically, there are still an infinite amount, but in reality, it's very much a finite number. Because confined waves become standing waves, the only standing waves that will exist in this space must be motionless at the edges. That means all standing waves will be some multiple of this wave here, or the fundamental frequency. You can create half, third, fourth, and so on wavelengths. Each one is a quantized variation of this fundamental frequency. But if you introduce a frequency that is not a quanta of the fundamental frequency, well, no you didn't. Everything you can imagine here is just some combination of quantized waves that fit in this space. This is why a guitar string always plays the same tones. Along with wavelength, standing waves possess two more characteristics to describe them. These are called nodes and antinodes. Nodes are locales on the wave that don't move at all, whereas antinodes are the locations where the most movement occurs. The number of nodes is how we characterize this wave's mode of vibration. Adding more nodes changes the mode of vibration and increases the wave's total energy. For a one-dimensional standing wave, mode of vibration is characterized by a single parameter. We'll call it n for nodes. Let's move to the second dimension. In the second dimension, we work with a drum head. Just like in the one-dimensional example, when we constrain the vibration of our drum head, any wave traveling towards the clamped boundary will reflect and interfere with itself. A drum head is really just an infinite number of one-dimensional waves. This means there also exists a fundamental or base frequency. This is the easiest to conceptualize as it is just the fundamental frequency of a one-dimensional wave with radial symmetry. The biggest change between 1 and 2 dimensions occurs with our nodes. Nodes are one dimension behind the wave. So in our one-dimensional wave, the nodes were zero-dimensional points, and now in 2 dimensions, our nodes become one-dimensional lines. The vibrational modes of our 2D waves are also defined by the number of nodes, or the parameter n. But when we increase this parameter, we see we always get radial symmetry. If a drumhead truly was an infinite amount of one-dimensional waves, then we should be seeing a wave like this somewhere. This would mean the center of our drumhead would be motionless and a node. But we can't have a point node at the center since nodes in 2 dimensions are lines. We can, however, draw a line straight across. Now we find the waves we are expecting. This new line is called an angular or linear node, and just as we can have multiple radial nodes, we can have multiple angular nodes. The vibrational mode of our 2D surface is characterized by 2 parameters. N dictates the number of radial nodes, and M dictates the number of angular or linear nodes. I want to highlight that a vibrating drumhead doesn't just vibrate in one of these patterns. In fact, it's almost certainly a combination of dozens of different patterns. But whatever is happening in a drumhead, you will always be able to decompose those vibrations into these modes of vibration. Here's a nice website that lets you monkey around and see how that would look like if you add different modes of vibration together. Let's move to the 3rd dimension. Here, things get a little difficult to conceptualize. Earlier, when we talked about one-dimensional waves, we visualized their excitations in the 2nd dimension, and for 2-dimensional waves, we visualize those excitations in the 3rd dimension. So with 3-dimensional waves, how do we visualize those excitations? As we have moved up a dimension, so too have the nodes. Now nodes exist as 2-dimensional surfaces, and just like with our drumhead, there are 2 types of nodes, radial and angular. Except these are no longer the parameters for the vibrational mode like we saw in the previous dimensions. I'll come back to that. Radial nodes are simply shells. These are easy to imagine as they're the radial nodes of the drumhead rotated into a sphere. Each shell means a spherical surface where the amplitude of the wave is always 0. If we were to cut our sphere in half and visualize excitation with color, then this behavior would look like a drumhead. However, this kind of radial behavior is only found in acoustic spherical harmonics, or within a physical medium. This wave oscillates between higher and lower pressure as the particulates of the medium compress against and expand away from each other. In quantum mechanics, we're not dealing with a physical medium or collections of particles. Instead, we're working with a single quantum object, or electron, which does behave like a wave, but also behaves like a particle. In order for us to say the amplitude at a given point is positive or negative, we need to know about the phase of the electron's wave function. However, when we measure an electron, that interaction collapses this wave function into a tiny region we call a particle. This isn't really useful for determining the phase of the wave function, so we can't. For this reason, spherical harmonics in quantum mechanics represents the probability that, at any given moment in time, if we measure the location of the electron, it will be in that location. These values are called probability densities. If we look at an oscillating wave, we see that it spends an equal amount of time positive as it does negative. So if we can't know the phase of the wave, we can just square our wave's maximum amplitude. Now we know where the wave is oscillating most, even if we don't know the phase. This represents the probability density and is what we do for electrons. These waves, or probability densities, are static and do not change with time. If I now solve the radial component of the Schrödinger equation for hydrogen electrons, and spawn points based on these probability densities, we can visualize electron orbitals. These spheres correspond to the s orbitals around a nucleus. I've got s1 through 3 plotted here. We now have the same dilemma with our drumhead. We have these clear nodes with radial symmetry, but none that go through the middle. Well, just like how we could trace a line through the middle of our drumhead, we can place a plane or angular node in the middle of our sphere. Adding angular nodes is when spherical harmonics start to get complicated. Spherical harmonics, or the solution to these 3D waves, is the product of the radial and angular components for those waves. Visualizations almost always exclusively focus on this angular component because, as we saw, the radial components are kind of trivial. However, if we look at this equation here, we see that the angular component does not depend on the radius, which is a very important caveat to highlight. What do I mean by this? Previously, on a drumhead, we can see that as we move away from the center, the amplitude of the wave changes with the radius. We also see this in the radial component of the spherical form. The amplitude changes with radius. However, what if I change the equation to be solely based on the radial angle or a variable called theta? Well, now the value is constant as I move away from the center. This function is no longer dependent on the radius. This is what is going on with the angular component of spherical harmonics. Solving the function here or here gives you the same value, which means these visualizations are confusing. This style is nice for showing the internal oscillation of the amplitudes, but where's the sphere? And this style is great because it shows the sphere, except I thought the radius of a sphere was a node, so why is the amplitude not 0 at the sphere's surface? Let's answer this by visualizing the angular component of this equation. We have our sphere. We place an angular node in the middle. This now means the pressure or amplitude of our acoustic wave will oscillate back and forth. Not super exciting. Animating this oscillation in volumetrics isn't very convenient, and so no one does it. Instead, what you do is take a sphere, solve the angular component for this location, then you either color that part of the sphere based on that value, displace that part of the sphere along the normal by that value, or you can set the radius of the sphere equal to the magnitude of the angular component, but color it to indicate if it's positive or negative. Now you can see why each style is valid and also why they are misleading. They represent how vibrations within a sphere are oscillating along the azimuthal and polar axes, but don't actually illustrate the internal 3D structure. What about when we add additional angular nodes? The vibrational mode of electron spherical harmonics is dictated by three values or quantum numbers, n, l, and m. These three numbers describe the angular and radial nodes. N represents the principal quantum number. We can think of this as the energy level or number of radial shells. You can also think about this as a row on the table of elements. L is the azimuthal quantum number and represents angular momentum of the electron. It defines the total number of angular nodes and also corresponds to the s, p, d, and f orbitals you may be familiar with. M is the magnetic quantum number and represents the degree to which the angular momentum of the electron is situated along the z-axis, as well as the number of angular nodes along the z-axis. I realize that probably doesn't make sense, so let's walk through each number and I can explain along the way. We're gonna ignore the principal quantum number since it doesn't change the shape. We will just look at how changing L and M affect the orbitals. We begin with L equals 0. This is the s orbital. As L represents the total number of angular nodes, there are none. As there are no angular nodes, M is also 0 since M represents the number of angular nodes along the z-axis. At L equals 1, we now have one angular node. This divides our sphere into two lobes and our wave oscillates back and forth. This is the p orbital. Since we now have angular nodes, it's possible they can be oriented differently. M represents the number of angular nodes along the z-axis, so we can have either 1 or 0 z-axis aligned angular nodes. Now M equals 1. But this value can equal positive or negative 1. Why is that? This is because the magnetic quantum number represents the alignment of the angular momentum along the z-axis. If we trace an axis along an orbital, we can see how similar that is to the z-axis. Imagine a yo-yo. If we provide no angular momentum, the yo-yo dangles straight down along the z-axis. This is m equals 0. If we provide some angular momentum, the yo-yo starts to move and point away from the z-axis. Conceptually, this is what is happening with the magnetic quantum number, However, the amount of angular momentum we can supply is quantized. So with L equals 1 or 1 angular node, the yo-yo either dangles or spins completely horizontally. There's no in-between state. The reason this value is either positive or negative is because although this shape is symmetrical, the actual equation says one lobe is positive and one is negative. But this is arbitrary. There's no reason it should be this way or this way. Despite being the same shape, these are two different states. Each suggests the electron should be located at opposite poles, which have completely different angular momentum. Therefore, despite occupying the same volume, this orbital represents two different angular momentums. Why then call it the magnetic quantum number when it describes angular momentum? This is because physicists measure m by applying a magnetic field to the atom. This would either increase or decrease the energy of the electron in the orbital, hence positive or negative values. Orbitals aligned with the z-axis would experience no change in energy, so that is why m equals 0 refers to orbitals aligned with the z-axis. Horizontal orbitals experience the greatest change in energy in a magnetic field, and so the maximum value of m refers to this horizontal orientation. Let's add another angular node. With L equals 2, we have two angular nodes. This state represents the d orbital, and since we have two angular nodes, we can now move one or both of these to align with the z-axis. As we move nodes to the z-axis, the orbitals start migrating out like our spinning yo-yo. When all nodes are aligned with the z-axis, all of the orbitals are found oriented horizontally. With L equals 3, we have three angular nodes. This is the f orbital. Again, moving nodes to the z-axis causes the orbitals to fan out. If we continue this process, we see a clear pattern emerge. The m equals 0 orbital is simply this vertically oscillating state, and as we increase m, the orbitals spread out and align themselves more with the horizontal plane. But since in chemistry, natural elements don't go past L equals 3, this pattern isn't clear and obvious, especially if chemistry is the context in which you are learning about these orbitals. The last caveat to clear up is the difference between complex and real orbitals. What you've seen so far, the familiar dumbbell and cloverleaf shapes that are used in every chemistry textbook, are what we call the real orbitals. However, they aren't the direct mathematical solutions of the Schrödinger equation. Let's go back to our L equals 1 or p orbitals. We said m equals 0 corresponds to an orbital aligned along the z-axis. Simple enough. But we also said m plus or minus 1 corresponds to orbitals that are oriented horizontally. If you solve the math directly, the orbitals for non-zero m values don't look like dumbbells. Instead, they look like donuts or toruses. These are the complex orbitals. The reason they're called complex is because they are described by complex numbers, numbers that have both a real and an imaginary part. You don't need to understand the math, but when you rotate real waves, or waves described by sine or cosine, their amplitude changes. At 90 degrees, there is no wave. There is no symmetry. If we give a wave rotational symmetry, then we can decompose that wave into two complementary components. We can use these two waves to describe this wave no matter the rotation. Adding the y component of this wave to this wave causes them to construct or destruct into our original wave. These complementary components are the real and imaginary parts of spherical harmonics. Both are the exact same wave, but just rotated 90 degrees from each other so as to preserve symmetry. However, as you may have noticed, rotating the wave causes the phase to change. Earlier, I said we can't know the phase of electrons, but with this solution, since rotation represents a change in phase, we can represent phase by coloring a continuum rotating around the orbital. Positive values going one way and negative values going the other. Now that we can visualize the rotational symmetry of electron orbitals, it's a little easier to apply our yo-yo example from earlier to describe how angular momentum reshapes them. These complex orbitals are a more fundamentally accurate depiction of the state of electrons around a nucleus. So why don't we use these donut shapes in chemistry? While they are mathematically pure, they don't point in specific directions like the x and y axes. This makes it hard to visualize how they would overlap to form chemical bonds. Generally, there's more utility in visualizing the orbitals like this. So, to come back to our original question, why do electron orbitals look so strange? It's because electrons are waves, and when you confine a wave to the tiny 3D space around a nucleus, it can only exist in specific standing wave patterns. These patterns are dictated by mathematical solutions called spherical harmonics. The weird lobes and spheres we see are simply the regions in space where you are most likely to find the electron for a given standing wave pattern. And the familiar shapes used in chemistry are just convenient, real-valued combinations of the more fundamental, complex, rotating wave solutions. They are two different, but equally valid ways of describing the weird, wacky world of the electron's quantum nature.
Can you draw a dot and another dot and connect them to draw a line? Now draw lots of lines. Connect lines to draw the basic shapes: square, triangle, circle. Now draw lots and lots of basic shapes. This is a duck. The duck can be broken down into basic shapes. For correct proportions, pay attention to the sizes of the basic shapes and how they compare to the other shapes around them. But also pay attention to the negative space. There are shapes around the duck too. You can trace to start off with, but practice this from observation to get even better. Basic shapes are the starting point you build upon. But how many shapes do you really need to represent a duck? What about 3D? Well, draw a square. Draw another square. Connect the corners, you have a 3D shape. Draw a triangle. Draw another triangle. Connect the corners, 3D shape. Draw lots of these 3D shapes. Remember the circle? Squash the circle to create an ellipse or a squashed circle. Draw lots of squashed circles. Draw one squashed circle and another squashed circle and connect their corners. Hey look, a tube or a cylinder. Draw lots of tubes. If you draw curved lines on the tube, notice the direction of the curve dictates the direction of the tube. Practice that. You can use spirals to practice that too. Let me put this into perspective for you. Draw a horizon line, mark a vanishing point in the middle, and draw lines coming out of the vanishing point. Nice 1-point perspective grid. On your grid, draw a square. Draw lines from the corners following the guide and connecting them with a straight vertical line. Nice 3D shape in 1-point perspective. Notice how shapes drawn above the horizon line show their bottom face, and shapes drawn below the horizon line show their top face. Shapes drawn both above and below the horizon line show neither face. Cool perspective. Notice how shapes drawn on the right of the center line show their left face, and shapes drawn on the left of the center line show their right face. You can construct other shapes out of squares by drawing on their faces, or draw them directly after practice. The better you get, the less you will need to rely on the guide. This 1-point perspective is good for indoor scenes. Let's get crazy with 2-point perspective. Draw a horizon line, mark 2 vanishing points at either end, and draw lines coming out of each vanishing point. 2-point perspective grid. Draw 2 vertical lines and connect them following the guide. Draw more lines following the guide towards the other vanishing point and connect them with a vertical line. Now you have a 3D shape in 2-point perspective. Again, noticing how the shapes appear above and below the horizon line. Don't be afraid to sketch it out and clean it up. It doesn't have to be precise. You can construct other shapes out of squares just like before. What happens when the vanishing points are super close together? You get this weird warped perspective, right? Usually the vanishing points are far off screen. Now practice combining shapes together, constructing whole scenes. 2D perspective is very good for outdoor scenes. Welcome back to our duck. Now that we know basic shapes, 3D shapes, 1-point and 2-point perspective, we can draw our duck in 3D perspective. Let's break it down into basic shapes again. Notice how this all fits within a square. We'll use this. Pay attention to the relationship between the shapes and the negative space. Using this as a guide, we can also draw the front view of the duck. Now using a 2-point perspective grid, draw the side square view following the perspective and build up the duck's shapes. Remember when I said to pay attention to the relationship between the shapes and negative space? Yeah, keep doing that. Now you can draw in the front view as thick as you like. How thick is your duck? Now we have a 3D constructed duck in perspective. You can use this as a base to build upon, smooth out and fix areas if you want. Keep practicing this and you won't even need the guide anymore. Cool, right? But what about organic shapes? Well, organic shapes are just block shapes smoothed out. You can imagine the faces of a basic 3D shape, being able to dissect them to create even more faces, extruding, pushing, pulling to create more complex shapes. There are endless amounts of faces. You can imagine it as a wireframe. See if you can draw 3D shapes with wireframes. Create some organic shapes. They may look complicated, but remember, they can be simplified into more basic shapes. Because everything is just shapes. Hands, they're just shapes. Anatomy, again, it's just shapes. A muscular duck flexing and popping a kickflip while wearing a backwards hat, shapes. Keep drawing shapes, and with practice, you too can draw whatever you want.
We can't keep a phone working for 10 years, but some designs will need to last 10,000 years if we want humanity to survive. Right now, there are nuclear waste sites that will stay dangerous for several millennia. Our job is to stop our descendants from digging up the radioactive waste. If they don't understand our warnings, they won't survive. But how do you warn people who won't share our language, symbols, or culture? How do you design architecture and objects that communicate with strangers thousands of years in the future? And this goes way beyond nuclear waste sites. This video is sponsored by Framer, a no-code website builder that lets you launch your site in minutes. But anyway, the problem is humans think in months, not millennia. Our entire lives are run by quarterly financial cycles, weekly trends, and even the recent past is foreign to us. Show this thing to a 10-year-old and they won't know what it is, and they certainly won't know how to use it or repair it. But this VCR was the most common way to watch movies only a few decades ago. If we struggle to explain a 30-year-old gadget to people alive today, how are we supposed to design a message to people thousands of years from now? It's really complicated. For example, back to the nuclear site. Why not just make a giant indestructible sign that can last 10,000 years to warn people? That'll keep people out, right? Nope. Language changes too much. Early modern English is barely understandable to us. Just try reading original Shakespeare manuscripts. Letting I dare not wait upon I would, like the poor cat of the adage. I have no idea what I just said. And that's only 400 years old, about 4% of the minimum amount of time the sign would need to be understandable for future humans. If you go back 1,200 years, English isn't even English as we know it anymore. It's basically unreadable without training. Cuneiform is one of the earliest written languages, and it's only 1,000 years old. And there are really only a couple hundred scholars who still understand the writings today. Okay, so language won't work, but what about designing a symbol? Some symbols have lasted for thousands of years and have become timeless icons. This symbol has been around for 7,000 years in Southern Asia as a sign of health, luck, and prosperity in the Hindu and Buddhist tradition. Certainly the meaning of this symbol would never change. Okay, so that idea probably isn't gonna work. So yeah, the meaning of symbols changes just like the language does. So a giant indestructible sign or symbol isn't gonna save us, at least not by itself. And if we fail to communicate real danger in this context, innocent people of the future will pay for the mistakes we've made today. It gets even worse when you realize that one consistent feature of humanity across all history is that we are very curious. If the designs we make today fail to convey danger, but instead look intriguing, mysterious, or sacred, future archaeologists will want to dig there. The more dangerous you make it seem, the more curious people are gonna be. This is like the core theme of pretty much every treasure hunting adventure movie ever. Now, I've painted a pretty bleak picture, and it seems like it's guaranteed that our future descendants are doomed to dig up a bunch of nuclear waste by accident. But through the power of design, there still is hope. The Acheulean hand axe proves this point. For over 1 million years across continents, people kept making the same teardrop shape. While it's true that no single hand axe was used for that entire time, the recipe for how it was made persisted. It survived because anyone from anywhere could recreate it from local stone with no written instructions. When the object can't last, the pattern for its use can survive. That's an important hint at how we make an object that is understandable tens of thousands of years later. To be fair, we don't know exactly what these hand axes were used for, but if you see a sharpened edge like this, it's fair to assume that it's designed to cut or tear. Even if the materials themselves might fail, if we can keep the tradition and culture around it alive, we have a fighting chance. And if a designed object's function can be understood just from its shape, it travels farther through time. For this video, I spent a lot of time thinking about what designs can last thousands of years while still serving their functional purpose, and I came across this story. In 1797, 2 boys discovered a subterranean cave in the Mendip Hills of England. Inside, they found scattered bones, barbed spears, periwinkle shells strung as necklaces, and several other ceremonial objects. Archaeologists later learned that this cave held the remains of a small hunter-gatherer society more than 10,000 years ago. It was a burial site. Burial sites are some of the earliest and most lasting man-made designs. They span cultures and eras, and it's a very straightforward design brief that simply asks the living to leave a place undisturbed. The finality of death is one of the only things our architecture can carry cleanly across millennia. As bleak as that might sound, this gives me hope, since the nuclear waste sites we were talking about before are essentially burial sites too. We bury our dead to remember, but we're burying this waste to forget it and keep people safe long after we're gone. As a technology for keeping something intact, burial is simple and smart. Hide it deep and let time do its work. This is a trend that you'll see across this video quite often. But this has a fatal twist. You'll notice that our first impulse was to explore that cave in the Mendip Hills of England. The moment a foreign culture discovers a site, things change. Markers that once said, "leave this alone," become invitations to unearth the burial. That's the tension. We worship Egyptian pyramids for surviving thousands of years, and then feel compelled to crack them open to see what's inside. So the question becomes, how do you keep people from exploring an ancient burial site? Charles Baldwin, an environmental health engineer, led an experiment to design the biohazard symbol. In testing, this symbol was demonstrated to be the most memorable with no prior meaning or association. He wanted something that was memorable but meaningless, so we could educate people as to what it means. It became a national standard, and unlike most other symbols, it doesn't reference an existing physical object or idea. But as mentioned before, even the most iconic symbols with the richest history can only go so far. Meanings do change. This symbol can mean many different things depending on the context. It can mean pirates, it can mean poison, it's also associated with treasure, Johnny Depp, or Halloween. So other experiments throughout the 1970s tried different methods to communicate danger across all cultures and languages. One answer was to skip symbols entirely and make the place feel scary through architecture. Spike fields, broken angles, jagged blocks. The goal is simple: trigger an instinct to stay away without needing a shared language. Spiky, jagged angles are pretty universally viewed with fear. It's biologically hardwired in us to see them as off-putting or scary. But even still, what looks terrifying to one culture can read as monumental art to another. Maybe the intimidating architecture would fascinate some curious people and motivate them to explore further. Other scientists thought of putting the scream face on signs, but once again, you risk turning a warning into an attraction. In my opinion, the design of this particular site should be unceremonious and uninteresting. No doors, no decorations, nothing that sparks curiosity. Make the site extremely low charisma and as high clarity as reasonably possible. But really, the best way to ensure that the nuclear waste stays buried underground goes way beyond the site itself. It's about creating redundancy and bureaucracy, public registries, off-site records, and boring recurring practices that keep the do not dig story alive without turning the place into a glamorous legend. It needs to be a system more than anything. Just like the Acheulean hand axe, you need to protect the cultural and contextual understanding to make the idea live on. You know, we've talked a lot today about how proper communication and presentation can quite literally save humanity from inevitable doom. Some designs last because they're impressive, others because they're everywhere and easy to access. Your website can be both. That's why I want to quickly talk to you about today's sponsor, Framer. It's a no-code website building tool that's genuinely impressive. I've been using Framer myself to build out a new design portfolio, and honestly, it's game-changing. You don't need to know any code, it just feels like using the design tools you're already familiar with, but instead of static mock-ups, you're creating real, live, animated websites. Here's how easy it is. I started by picking one of over 1,000 professionally designed templates and customized it to showcase my work. You can even add super slick, no-code scroll animations to make everything feel polished and interactive. Custom domains and lightning-fast hosting are built in, so publishing is really just a few clicks. The entire process took me just a couple of hours from start to finish. Framer has built-in SEO tools and analytics so you can understand how and where visitors engage with your work. It also has an advanced content management system to help you manage and organize your website efficiently. It's perfect for anyone looking to launch a portfolio, marketing site, or landing page. Framer can help you make whatever you need to put your best foot forward online. If you're a creative person or marketer, or really anyone who wants to quickly launch a professional, visually impressive website without the hassle, Framer is the tool for you. Launch your site for free at framer.com and use my promo code for a free month of Framer Pro. This one's worth the hype. I highly recommend Framer. Back to the video. Without cultural caretakers, even the most durable design drifts into myth or becomes forgotten. The Svalbard Seed Vault is fighting against this possibility. It's designed to be remembered and preserved. It's essentially a doomsday vault burrowed 100 meters into Arctic bedrock within the permafrost, holding over 1 million seed samples of crops from around the world. About 15 crops supply 90% of the world's food, which means a single blight, war, or grid failure can destroy entire species of plants that we rely on to survive. If climate change or disaster wipes out all vegetation, or even some of it, this vault contains many of the seeds that could help us regrow. Even if the power fails at Svalbard, the cold permafrost could keep the seeds preserved for hundreds, or in some cases, thousands of years. There are already hundreds of seed banks very similar to this, but they're vulnerable to flood, fire, politics, and war. That's why Svalbard exists as a backup to all these backups. Every collection of seeds here is a duplicate of something stored elsewhere, sealed and still owned by the depositor. Organizations store their seeds here, and the owner can withdraw them whenever they need to. And the system works. During the Syrian civil war, researchers were no longer able to access their seed collection in Aleppo because it became a dangerous war zone. If the samples were destroyed in the fog of war, some plant species would be gone forever. But they fortunately had backups at Svalbard. They withdrew seeds from there, regrew them in safer locations, and then redeposited fresh duplicates in Lebanon. The Svalbard vault sits a few hundred miles from the North Pole on a frozen island, which makes it relatively safe from war and natural disaster. But what really keeps it alive is institutional will. Hundreds of countries and organizations have a stake in making sure the vault survives. Without that institutional heft, even the most durable concrete will eventually crumble. Most designed objects that last a while tend to have institutional backing. The building looks very severe and bleak on the outside, in my opinion, and when you go inside, it's not much better. It just looks like a freezing, hyper-functional Amazon warehouse, more like a morgue than an inspiring museum. And I guess when you're designing something that's meant to preserve humanity's future in the middle of the Arctic, there just isn't a lot of room for excess. But I really do wish that the design rose to the occasion a little bit more, especially considering how important it is. The one humane gesture is the glowing glass and steel beacon on the facade, a shifting band of light contrasted against a brutalist concrete wedge, symbolizing hope in a desolate place. It's a quiet signal that something human is being protected here. The Svalbard Seed Vault stands in sharp contrast to monuments that try to endure by becoming important cultural objects rather than reliable systems. Strategically, this can work. People are more likely to protect things that have cultural value, that's true, but that cultural value also can become a target. When a nation is conquered, an invader's takeover is not just about acquiring land and resources, it's about destroying cultural identity. This is why one of the first targets of any conquest starts with destroying libraries. A new regime ensures their vision of the future survives by erasing the past. The Library of Alexandria was one of the largest and most significant knowledge projects of the ancient world. It was damaged and destroyed as regimes shifted. The conqueror Umar I supposedly said that the Library of Alexandria was not necessary, since his religious books had all of the knowledge anyone could need, so he burnt the Library of Alexandria to the ground. It was over 600,000 scrolls in total, or the equivalent of like 120,000 modern books. The scrolls were reportedly used to heat the public baths of Alexandria, and it supposedly took 6 months to burn all of it. Only 1 in 10 Greek classics survived the burnings. Gone forever. And this is hardly a rare occurrence. The burning of the books during the Qin dynasty, the Mongolian sacking of Baghdad, the Spanish destruction of Mayan codices, Nazi book burnings, the list is endless. It can take centuries to build a cultural treasure and only a single careless act to destroy it. That's why starting anew with a clean slate has been one of the most harmful ideas in history. Imperial sackings, purges, and book burnings are all incredibly harmful because they're so easy to achieve and almost impossible to undo. But there are rare exceptions to this rule. In 1196, the Sultan of Egypt wanted to destroy the pyramids. Allegedly, he thought there was treasure underneath or something. Because the cultural relevance was lost to him, he had no problem destroying the priceless cultural artifact. But the structure was extremely difficult to demolish. They had to remove each individual brick one at a time. It was taking as long to destroy the pyramid as it took to build it. After 8 months of hard labor, all they were able to do was put a dent in the smallest of the 3 pyramids before they just gave up. The sheer magnitude of an object can outlast even the most determined conqueror's destructive carelessness. But there are other strategies that make things difficult to erase as well. Check out this little metal disc. Notice the letters spiraling smaller and smaller. If you zoom in a little bit, you'll see a series of little rectangles, each one only 0.5 millimeter wide, about the width of 5 human hairs. If you zoom in even closer than that, you'll notice those rectangles aren't solid blocks. They're actually individual pages written in over 1,000 languages. Modern research has shown that without written records, it only takes about 3 generations to lose the memory of something historically significant, like a disaster, for example. Even language itself is dying at an alarming rate. 50 to 90% of the world's languages are predicted to disappear in the next century, many with little or no significant documentation. Rosetta Disk is a very small, very stubborn answer to that. There are over 13,000 pages written in over 1,500 languages. All of this is etched into a palm-sized sheet of hyper-durable nickel. This artifact could plausibly last thousands of years. And because each page is a physical etching, you don't need any software to read it, although you do need a powerful microscope. Individual pages are visible around 100x magnification. The key here is that it doesn't require software or electricity to decode, just magnification. The spiraling text that gradually gets smaller and smaller is really clever in my opinion. Even if you don't understand the more visible inscriptions on the surface, the design sort of encourages you to look more closely in order to read the full text. The glass dome on top also magnifies the text slightly. There's one critically important strategy of the Rosetta Disk. With many giant monuments, they persist because they're simply too big to destroy. But with the Rosetta Disk, the strategy is to make it tiny and make lots of copies. The trick is balancing durability and cultural value without turning it into a target for thieves. Anything rare enough to be priceless is also loot in the next conquest or culture war, but if you make thousands of copies, at least a few are likely to survive. That's why you should also subscribe to this channel, so these ideas can live on in all of us. But anyway, that's why alongside a few immaculate museum-grade discs, the Long Now Foundation also made a more widely reproducible version, the Rosetta Wearable. It contains fewer pages than the full disc, but anyone can own one if they make a very generous $1,000 donation. In 2016, they even sent a probe out into space to put a Rosetta disc on Comet 67P. It's almost certain that no one is ever going to read this thing, at least on that comet, but it still proves the point. Spreading the risk across space, institutions, and pockets maximizes the chance of at least one of these discs surviving tens of thousands of years into the future. Archivists call this strategy locks. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. Religious institutions are arguably the most durable of mankind's cultural organizations. While these institutions are far from perfect, at their best, they can move people beyond immediate self-interest toward a greater good. But over millennia, even religions rise and fall. So what can you build that points past any single culture? One organization's plan is to honor time itself. This is a small prototype of the Clock of the Long Now. The final build has been underway since 2009, designed around one question: what lets an object survive 10,000 years? The team behind the design have studied what keeps artifacts alive and folded those lessons all into this clock. To last 10,000 years, an object needs a set of features that are seemingly contradictory. It needs extreme durability, yet regular maintenance. It needs to be awe-inspiring, but not so charismatic that people destroy it as a statement. And it needs to be understandable to everyone, yet hard to access. Let's talk about the durability. It's made of materials like titanium, ceramic, stainless steel, and sapphire. These materials will allow it to survive for 10,000 years with minimal corrosion or wear. Even if we all blow ourselves up or face some other apocalyptic event, it is conceivable that this clock could still be maintained and repaired by just a few people with fairly primitive technology. The clock is fully mechanical and serviceable with Bronze Age tools and technology. All mechanical clocks eventually go out of time, so it can self-correct for several decades without any human intervention. The clock calibrates itself from the sun. Around the summer solstice, the sun's light shines down into a small chamber. That sunbeam heats up a trigger that synchronizes the clock to true solar noon. But even the strongest materials can corrode, and that's why they chose to bury the clock hundreds of feet deep into an extremely dry mountaintop in Texas. The temperature remains a stable 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, and the dry climate slows down corrosion. It's a perfect environment for an eternal clock. But that's still not enough. The real thing that will keep this design alive for 10,000 years is stewardship. The clock depends on visitors to adjust the time and maintain the site. It needs us to survive and to function. Admittedly, we haven't been the best stewards in the past. Valuable things get stolen, and curious people will tinker and accidentally break things. Just look at how we excavate and open ancient tombs. But perhaps another deterrent from that is the continual maintenance and modification of the design. The makers of this clock don't really expect it to be a static, unchanging artifact. They have designed it to be repaired, modified, and continually developed, rather than sealed away and preserved. Things survive when communities keep working on them. The Torah is a religious text that is over 3,000 years old. A common ritual in Jewish tradition is to copy each individual letter of the Torah onto a new scroll. It can take over a year for a trained scribe to copy almost 305,000 letters. And if even one single error is made, the entire scroll may be considered invalid. The constant reading, repairing, and copying of the document has become a powerful ritual that ensures longevity. The same will hopefully be true for this 10,000-year clock. Another aspect that's important to preservation is location. The choice to put the clock deep inside of a remote mountain is a practical engineering choice, but it's also driven by psychology. High deserts with broad horizons make the site impressive. You hike up a desert mountain, go into a dark tunnel, climb a spiral staircase cut directly into the stone of the mountain. You pass the massive 10,000-pound bronze weight that powers the clock. You move past these massive gears. Perhaps the most important part of any lasting artifact is to make it awe-inspiring. And a visit to this site is designed to feel more like a religious pilgrimage rather than a tourist attraction. Of course, predicting the future is impossible. We have no idea if the clock will make it to 10,000 years or even just 10. Just look at any sci-fi illustration from the 1900s trying to show what the year 2000 would look like and just see how incredibly far off they were. The pace of technology and change is only accelerating, making the future even more uncertain than ever. Maybe the project will be completely forgotten, but even if the clock doesn't last that long, it still isn't necessarily a failure. Leonardo da Vinci dedicated over 500 drawings and 35,000 words to the concept of flying or flight. Even though da Vinci never flew, he brought attention to that idea, and his concepts helped to make flight feel possible, even inevitable, for later generations. This is what Thomas Frey refers to as an attractor. If we can change people's vision of the future, we can change people's behaviors today. And it's the same thing with this clock. It's also an attractor. It's an invitation for us to think out thousands of years. Even if the mechanism changes or fades, it anchors a habit. Show up, wind the weight, and take a longer view of humanity and our choices. The clock is a concrete picture of deep time that bends behavior now and hopefully steers us towards a better future. Even when the clock dies, the idea of deep time can still live on. Right now, a golden record is riding on the Voyager probes into deep space. It contains songs, images, and greetings from our tiny world pressed into metal. The odds that any sentient beings will find it, decipher it, and understand it are basically zero. But that's not really the point, at least in my opinion. It's our way of saying we were here and we cared. Humans live by imagining tomorrow and changing today. We don't always know why. We just look forward and build. I'm still afraid of things ending. It's not really fear of death, whether it's mine or my designs. It's knowing there's still so much I want to create and there's never enough time. I'll never finish everything, and you won't either. All of it will fade. So why build anything at all? For me, it's connection while I'm here. When I make these videos, I talk with my editor, I argue with friends about the cut, I read your comments and consider new perspectives, or maybe I'll spot a product I designed out in the wild. It's my way of saying, I tried to leave you something useful. In a similar way, these 10,000-year designs are for us, the people alive now, as much as they are for the people of the future. Creating, building, and changing our world fills the time productively and makes the present feel worthwhile. It says tomorrow is worth imagining because someone else will be here to enjoy it. None of us will beat time. All we can do is work together to carry the weight a little farther. That's what these designs are trying to do. They tell our descendants that we care enough to make something for them. Even if we're successful, no one will know our names. But maybe we can help them to keep going just a little bit longer, and that's enough for me. If you enjoyed this video, consider supporting me on Patreon. I want to give a big shout out to my existing patrons, as well as any of the people who helped me with this video, especially my big brother Joe and my good friend Rafi. I hope you learned something and have a
What you are looking at is a visual representation of Wikipedia, a website that I can almost guarantee you've used at some point in your life. Each circle represents one of the 6.3 million English Wikipedia articles, and these are the nearly 200 million links between these articles that form the network of Wikipedia. This graph is the culmination of months of work, thousands of lines of code, and an absurd amount of computation time. And I know what you might be thinking. What a complete waste of time. Because other than looking mildly interesting, we can't really extract any useful information from this graph in its current state. But I promise that if you stay with me and watch this video, not only will you come to understand this graph, but you just might learn a couple of interesting things along the way. Let's start by understanding the different colors of this graph. Each color represents different communities which were algorithmically determined. A community is a group of nodes, or in this case articles, which are more tightly linked to each other than they are to other articles in the rest of the network. In total, the algorithm detected 44 different communities. The idea behind finding these communities is to group similar articles together, since, in theory, articles which are more closely linked to each other should also have more similar content. In order to test this theory, I looked at the categories for each of the articles in a given community and found the most common categories within that community. For example, if we look at community number 3, which has over 760,000 articles, we'll find that the most common categories of articles are related to politics and law. It's in this community which we'd find the articles of the United States presidents. Now let's look at community number 5, and we'll find that this community is all about music, and it's where you're most likely to find all your favorite musicians. Community number 10 is where you'll find video games, and there's a high likelihood that every video game you've ever played has a corresponding article in this community. Now, having communities about politics, music, and video games makes sense, because they're both popular and broad subjects. But not all of the communities are so straightforward. For example, the top categories of community number 11 are about space objects, and community number 19 is related to Norwegian politicians. One of the most interesting things about the way the articles are separated into different communities is the way they can reflect society. For example, community number 6 is all about English and American movies and television, but there are also two separate communities for Indian and Korean movies and television. This shows the popularity of both Indian and Korean cinema and their distinct separation from Western cinema. I thought it would be interesting to look at films like Parasite and RRR, which come from Korea and India respectively, but found massive success in America as well. These movies were more closely linked to American cinema than most other foreign films. Moving on, one of my favorite communities in this graph is community number 14. The top categories here are pretty evenly split between Canadian people and hockey, which I guess just shows how closely linked hockey and Canada are to each other. In these cases, it's easy to understand the way articles have been grouped into their different communities, but that's not always the case. Let's look at the general classifications for each community with a notable amount of articles. What I find interesting about this list is that the top categories from half of these communities are related to different sports. If you were to ask a human to broadly categorize all of the articles on Wikipedia, there's a good chance they would put most, if not all, the sports articles into a single group, while the Wikipedia network would suggest that they are all quite separate from each other. So now we understand the colors of the graph and the layout of the graph, but what about the different sizes of each circle? The size of each circle, or node, is proportional to the amount of incoming links to its corresponding article. In other words, the more times an article is linked to by other articles, the bigger its node will be. For example, the article for basketball is referenced by 44,000 other articles, so it's going to be bigger than the articles for free agent and golf, which are linked to less times. Something interesting we can do with the graph is look at all of the links to a specific article to see how much of an impact it has on the overall graph. For example, the article for COVID-19 is one of the fastest growing and most linked to articles, with over 46,000 articles referencing it. When visualized, it looks like this. 46,000 incoming links is a lot, but it's still a relatively small amount when compared to the most referenced articles on Wikipedia. For example, over 100,000 articles linked to the article for World War I. However, even that is significantly less than the 189,000 articles that linked to the article for World War II. On a side note, I find it interesting how the graphs for World War I and World War II are similar to each other, showing how articles with a similar type of content also share similar links. Despite the article for World War II being referenced nearly 200,000 times, it's only the fourth most linked to article on the English Wikipedia. The second most referenced article has over 240,000 links to it, and it belongs to the article for association football, or soccer. The interesting thing about this graph is that even though it has more links, most of the links come from within the same community for football articles, with a lot of links originating from articles on football players and teams. There's still one more article left, which is referenced more than any other article on Wikipedia. Linked to by nearly 280,000 other articles, the article with the single biggest impact on the Wikipedia graph is the United States. That's right, the most referenced article on Wikipedia isn't about a famous person or a historical event, it's about a country. In fact, I found that 38% of all articles on Wikipedia make reference to articles of countries. And this made me curious, what if I made a map where the size of each dot is proportional to the number of links to its corresponding Wikipedia article? It may be hard to determine a pattern of which countries have more links to them, but I think it becomes a lot clearer when I highlight these countries. According to Wikipedia, these are the top 25 countries from which people contribute to the English Wikipedia. You'll notice a fairly consistent overlap with the highlighted countries having the largest circles. There are some exceptions, like Iran, which has many thousands of articles for villages and counties in Iran that were created by a bot, but for the most part, it's pretty consistent. People will naturally want to write about things that interest them and things they're familiar with, and many times that will end up linking back to the country they live in. So along with the United States being a global superpower and one of the most populated countries, it also has the most contributors to the English Wikipedia, so it makes sense that it's linked to more than any other article. So now that we understand the colors of the graph and the size of the circles, I want to talk about the inspiration for this whole project. If you haven't heard of it, the Wikipedia Race, or Wikipedia game, is a game where you try to get from one Wikipedia page to another by only clicking links within the articles. Oftentimes you are racing against other people or trying to minimize the number of clicks it takes. For example, if you wanted to get from the article for Pokemon to the article for Ancient Egypt, you could do so in 2 clicks. First by clicking on the link to pets in the Pokemon article, and then the link for Ancient Egypt in the pet article. Oftentimes this game is played by ignoring links in the references and see also sections of articles, so when I constructed the graph, I also ignored links in these sections, since these are not necessarily a part of the article. One question I've always wondered when playing this game is, does a path of links exist from every article to every other article on Wikipedia? Well, it turns out the simple answer to that question is no, and the reason is orphans. On Wikipedia, an orphan is an article which has no other articles that link to it. If one of these orphaned articles was selected as the target article for a Wikipedia race, then let's just say you'd be playing for a very long time. In total, I found over 350,000 articles, or about 5% of all Wikipedia articles, which were orphaned. Another reason why a path doesn't exist from every article to every other article is because of dead ends. Dead end articles are articles which have no links to any other articles on Wikipedia. If you started at a dead end page or somehow found yourself at a dead end page during a Wikipedia race, then you'd be stuck with no way to get to any other article. These are quite a bit rarer than orphaned articles, with only about 6,000 articles being dead ends. Now wait, if orphaned articles exist and dead end articles exist, does that imply the existence of dead end orphaned articles? Well, it turns out that a little over 2,000 dead end orphans exist on Wikipedia, articles which have no incoming or outgoing links. On top of being the most depressing sounding types of articles on Wikipedia, I can't even show you these articles on the graph because they completely mess up the graphing algorithm, causing the rest of the graph to become too compressed, and leading to these articles becoming lost and forgotten. So now we know we can't create a path between every pair of articles on Wikipedia, but these dead-end and orphaned articles make up only a small percentage of total Wikipedia pages. The vast majority of the Wikipedia graph is actually pretty well connected. For example, if you wanted to get from the Harry Ball theorem to Pepsi fruit juice flood, you could do that in just 4 clicks. If you wanted to, you could go from baby Jesus theft to buffalo, 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 buffalo in 5 clicks. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that for most pairs of articles on Wikipedia, a path does exist, and you can usually get from one article to a completely unrelated article in a surprisingly small amount of clicks. And this made me think of the 6 degrees of separation concept, the idea that every person is just 6 or less social links away from every other person. I wondered, if you ignored dead-end and orphan pages, could this same idea be applied to the articles of Wikipedia? Well, in order to test this, I started by selecting a random Wikipedia page. In this case, it was the article for Pluto. For the sake of this visualization, I'll make all the other dots the same size and color. Now we can plot the articles in the first degree of separation. These are articles that are directly linked to by the Pluto article. In total, there are 255. Next, let's highlight the articles in the second degree of separation. These are the articles that are directly linked to by the articles in the first degree of separation. In total, there are over 20,000, and you can already see how fast the number of articles is growing. This growth really explodes in the third degree of separation. In just 3 degrees of separation, we've gone from a single article to reaching over 618,000 articles. And this growth continues with nearly 3 million articles being reached in the 4th degree of separation. At this point, we've already managed to reach over 3.6 million articles in total, which is over half of all Wikipedia articles. This causes something interesting to happen in the 5th degree of separation, where the number of articles reached starts to decrease. In hindsight, it makes sense. We've already reached the majority of articles in the graph, so the number of articles reached in the following degree will start to decrease, and it continues to decrease with the 6th degree of separation as well. We've now reached over 5.7 million articles, which is a lot, but it's still only about 90% of all articles. This means that while we can reach the large majority of articles in 6 degrees of separation, we can't reach all of them. We can keep increasing the degrees of separation until the growth becomes negligible. We can view each degree of separation separately to really get an idea of how many articles were in each degree of separation. If we view the growth on a graph, we can see it increases slowly at first, then very rapidly, and then very slowly again. Of course, this is just what happened when I selected Pluto as the starting article, so I tested this again with a number of different articles. Articles which had thousands of links in the 1st degree, and articles which only had a single link, and they all followed the same pattern. What's interesting is that all the graphs start to flatten out around the 7th or 8th degree of separation at the same number of articles, at 5.85 million articles reached. This accounts for about 92% of all articles. The remaining 8% of articles are unreachable from the rest of the graph. As we already discussed, about 5.5% of these articles are orphans. The remaining 2.5% are orphaned groups. These are groups of articles which have links between each other, but are not linked to by any other articles. Many of these are groups of the articles for villages and towns in Iran, but my favorite orphan group has to be of the Acton family. Consisting of 4 English members of parliament during the 1300s, these articles all make reference to each other, but are not linked to by any other articles on Wikipedia. Oh, and it just so happens that these articles, and these 4 articles alone, make up the entirety of community number 42. So now we know that for in the large majority of cases, a path exists between 2 articles, and it will almost always be 8 or fewer links long. But what is the average path length between 2 articles? To test this, I randomly picked 10,000 pairs of articles and calculated the path length for each of them. On average, the path length between 2 articles was 4.8. It's worth noting that about 8% of the time, a path did not exist. This is consistent with how we found about 8% of articles to be unreachable from the main graph. You'll also notice that paths with lengths less than 3 and greater than 8 were extremely rare. In fact, only one path of the 10,000 tested had a length of 10. This made me wonder, what's the longest path between 2 articles on Wikipedia? Now, as I already mentioned, finding 2 articles whose shortest path between them is 10 or more is extremely rare, only happening about 0.01% of the time. Therefore, a path with a length of 15 would be incredibly rare. A path with a length of 30 would seem pretty much impossible. But what if I told you the longest path I found was over 60 links long? Sorry, did I say 60? I meant to say 160. 166 to be exact. This path starts at the article for athletics in the 1953 Arab Games and finishes at a list of highways numbered 999. The reason this path is so long is because the only way to reach the list of highways numbered 999 is to start at the list of highways numbered 825 and then tediously click each successive number until you reach 999. It takes a really long time, but it's the only way to connect these 2 articles. I guess in some ways, it's kinda like an actual highway. I can't say for certain that this is the longest path on Wikipedia, as calculating every single path is not feasible, but it's certainly one of the longest. Those were pretty much the most interesting things I found in the Wikipedia graph. But I wanted to talk about one last thing. One last article, actually. At first glance, Fanta Cake looks like a normal, albeit short, article, but there's actually something pretty special about it. You see, it only has one link, Fanta Kuchen, but when you click it, it actually redirects back to itself. Redirect pages exist on Wikipedia to help people find pages easier. For example, if I search for USA, it automatically redirects me to the United States article. The page for the USA is just a redirect page. In the case of Fanta Kuchen, it simply redirects to Fanta Cake. But for some reason, the only link on Fanta Cake is to Fanta Kuchen, creating a sort of self-loop. Technically speaking, Fanta Cake is actually a dead end, because as I discussed earlier, there are no paths to any other articles. I like to call this a disguised dead end, because it appears to have a link at first, but upon closer inspection, it's really just linking back to itself. But that's not what makes Fanta Cake unique. There's actually a handful of disguised dead ends. You see, what makes Fanta Cake special is that it's also an orphan page, making it a disguised dead end orphan. The only one of its kind. At least, it was when I started making this video, but since then, it's actually been edited and has links to other pages. It's for this same reason that when you watch this video, a lot of the information might be slightly incorrect or outdated. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. In fact, that's the beauty of Wikipedia. It's an ever-growing and ever-changing network of information. A place where anyone has the power to free an article from an existence of solitude.